Hi everyone. So in this video, I would like to continue our general audience series on large language models like ChatGPT. Now in the previous video, deep dive into LLMs that you can find on my YouTube, we went into a lot of the under the hood fundamentals of how these models are trained and how you should think about their cognition or psychology. Now, in this video, I want to go into more practical applications of these tools. I want to show you lots of examples. I want to take you through all the different settings that are available. And I want to show you how I use these tools and how you can also use them in your own life and work. So let's dive in. Okay, so first of all, the webpage that I have pulled up here is chatgpt.com. Now, as you might know, ChatGPT was developed by OpenAI and deployed in 2022. So this was the first time that people could actually just kind of like talk to a large language model through a text interface. And this went viral and all over the place on the internet. And this was huge. Now, since then, though, the ecosystem has grown a lot. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of examples of ChatGPT specifically. But now in 2025, there's many other apps that are kind of like ChatGPT-like. And this is now a much bigger and richer ecosystem. So in particular, I think ChatGPT by OpenAI is this original gangster incumbent. It's most popular and most feature-rich also because it's been around the longest. But there are many other kind of clones available, I would say. I don't think it's too unfair to say. But in some cases, there are kind of like unique experiences that are not found in ChatGPT, and we're going to see examples of those. So for example, Big Tech has followed with a lot of kind of ChatGPT-like experiences. So for example, Gemini, Meta AI, and Copilot from Google, Meta, and Microsoft respectively. And there's also a number of startups. So for example, Anthropic has Claude, which is kind of like a ChatGPT equivalent. xAI, which is Elon's company, has Grok. And there's many others. So all of these here are from the United States companies, basically. DeepSeek is a Chinese company, and LeChat is a French company, Mistral. Now, where can you find these and how can you keep track of them? Well, number one, on the internet somewhere, but there are some leaderboards. And in the previous video, I've shown you Chatbot Arena is one of them. So here you can come to some ranking of different models, and you can see sort of their strength or ELO score. And so this is one place where you can keep track of them. I would say like another place maybe is this SEAL leaderboard from Scale. And so here you can also see different kinds of evals and different kinds of models and how well they rank. And you can also come here to see which models are currently performing the best on a wide variety of tasks. So understand that the ecosystem is fairly rich, but for now, I'm going to start with OpenAI because it is the incumbent and is most feature rich, but I'm going to show you others over time as well. So let's start with ChatGPT. What is this text box, and what do we put in here? Okay, so the most basic form of interaction with a language model is that we give it text and then we get some text back in response. So as an example, we can ask to get a haiku about what it's like to be a large language model. So this is a good kind of example task for a language model because these models are really good at writing. So writing haikus or poems or cover letters or resumes or email replies, they're just good at writing. So when we ask for something like this, what happens looks as follows. The model basically responds, words flow like a stream, endless echoes never mine, ghost of thought unseen. Okay, it's pretty dramatic. But what we're seeing here in ChatGPT is something that looks a bit like a conversation that you would have with a friend. These are kind of like chat bubbles. Now, we saw in the previous video is that what's going on under the hood here is that this is what we call a user query, this piece of text. And this piece of text and also the response from the model, this piece of text is chopped up into little text chunks that we call tokens. So this sequence of text is under the hood, a token sequence, one-dimensional token sequence. Now, the way we can see those tokens is we can use an app like, for example, Tick Tokenizer. So making sure that GPT-4o is selected, I can paste my text here. And this is actually what the model sees under the hood. My piece of text to the model looks like a sequence of exactly 15 tokens. And these are the little text chunks that the model sees. Now, there's a vocabulary here of 200,000 roughly of possible tokens. And then these are the token IDs corresponding to all these little text chunks that are part of my query. And you can play with this and update it, and you can see that, for example, this is case sensitive. You would get different tokens, and you can kind of edit it and see live how the token sequence changes. So our query was 15 tokens, and then the model response is right here, and it responded back to us with a sequence of exactly 19 tokens. So that haiku is this sequence of 19 tokens. Now, So we said 15 tokens and it said 19 tokens back. Now, because this is a conversation and we want to actually maintain a lot of the metadata that actually makes up a conversation object, this is not all that's going on under the hood. And we saw in the previous video a little bit about the conversation format. So it gets a little bit more complicated in that we have to take our user query and we have to actually use this chat format. So let me delete the system message. I don't think it's very important for the purposes of understanding what's going on. Let me paste my message as the user, and then let me paste the model response as an assistant. And then let me crop it here properly. The tool doesn't do that properly. So here we have it as it actually happens under the hood. There are all these special tokens that basically begin a message from the user, and then the user says, and this is the content of what we said. And then the user ends, and then the assistant begins and says this, etc. Now, the precise details of the conversation format are not important. What I want to get across here is that what looks to you and I as little chat bubbles going back and forth, under the hood, we are collaborating with the model, and we're both writing into a token stream. And these two bubbles back and forth were in a sequence of exactly 42 tokens under the hood. I contributed some of the first tokens, and then the model continued the sequence of tokens with its response. And we could alternate and continue adding tokens here. And together, we are building out a token window, a one-dimensional sequence of tokens. Okay, so let's come back to ChatGPT now. What we are seeing here is kind of like little bubbles going back and forth between us and the model. Under the hood, we are building out a one-dimensional token sequence. When I click New Chat here, that wipes the token window. That resets the tokens to basically 0 again, and restarts the conversation from scratch. Now, the cartoon diagram that I have in my mind when I'm speaking to a model looks something like this. When we click New Chat, we begin a token sequence. So this is a one-dimensional sequence of tokens. The user, we can write tokens into this stream, and then when we hit Enter, we transfer control over to the language model. And the language model responds with its own token streams. And then the language model has a special token that basically says something along the lines of, I'm done. So when it emits that token, the ChatGPT application transfers control back to us, and we can take turns. Together, we are building out the token stream, which we also call the context window. So the context window is kind of like this working memory of tokens, and anything that is inside this context window is kind of like in the working memory of this conversation, and is very directly accessible by the model. Now, what is this entity here that we are talking to, and how should we think about it? Well, this language model here, we saw that the way it is trained, in the previous video we saw there are two major stages, the pre-training stage and the post-training stage. The pre-training stage is kind of like taking all of internet, chopping it up into tokens, and then compressing it into a single kind of like zip file. But the zip file is not exact. The zip file is lossy and probabilistic zip file, because we can't possibly represent all of internet in just one sort of like, say, terabyte of zip file, because there's just way too much information. So we just kind of get the gestalt or the vibes inside this zip file. Now, what's actually inside the zip file are the parameters of a neural network. And so, for example, a 1 terabyte zip file would correspond to roughly, say, 1 trillion parameters inside this neural network. And what this neural network is trying to do is it's trying to basically take tokens and it's trying to predict the next token in a sequence. But it's doing that on internet documents. So it's kind of like this internet document generator, right? And in the process of predicting the next token in a sequence on internet, the neural network gains a huge amount of knowledge about the world. And this knowledge is all represented and stuffed and compressed inside the 1 trillion parameters, roughly, of this language model. Now, this pre-training stage also we saw is fairly costly. So this can be many tens of millions of dollars, say like 3 months of training and so on. So this is a costly, long phase. For that reason, this phase is not done that often. So for example, GPT-4o, this model was pre-trained probably many months ago, maybe like even a year ago by now. And so that's why these models are a little bit out of date. They have what's called a knowledge cutoff, because that knowledge cutoff corresponds to when the model was pre-trained. and its knowledge only goes up to that point. Now, some knowledge can come into the model through the post-training phase, which we'll talk about in a second. But roughly speaking, you should think of these models as kind of like a little bit out of date, because pre-training is way too expensive and happens infrequently. So any kind of recent information, like if you wanted to talk to your model about something that happened last week or so on, we're going to need other ways of providing that information to the model, because it's not stored in the knowledge of the model. So we're going to have various tool use to give that information to the model. Now, after pre-training, there's the second stage called post-training. And the post-training stage is really attaching a smiley face to this zip file, because we don't want to generate internet documents. We want this thing to take on the persona of an assistant that responds to user queries. And that's done in a process of post-training, where we swap out the dataset for a dataset of conversations that are built out by humans. So this is basically where the model takes on this persona, and that actually, so that we can like ask questions and it responds with answers. So it takes on the style of an assistant, that's post-training, but it has the knowledge of all of internet, and that's by pre-training. So these two are combined in this artifact. Now, the important thing to understand here, I think, for this section is that what you are talking to is a fully self-contained entity by default. This language model, think of it as a 1 terabyte file on a disk. Secretly, that represents 1 trillion parameters and their precise settings inside the neural network that's trying to give you the next token in a sequence. But this is the fully self-contained entity. There's no calculator, there's no computer and Python interpreter, there's no World Wide Web browsing, there's none of that. There's no tool use yet in what we've talked about so far. You're talking to a zip file. If you stream tokens to it, it will respond with tokens back. And the zip file has the knowledge from pre-training, and it has the style and form from post-training. And so that's roughly how you can think about this entity. Okay, so if I had to summarize what we talked about so far, I would probably do it in the form of an introduction of ChatGPT in a way that I think you should think about it. So the introduction would be, hi, I'm ChatGPT. I'm a 1 terabyte zip file. My knowledge comes from the internet, which I read in its entirety about 6 months ago, and I only remember vaguely, okay? And my winning personality was programmed, by example, by human labelers at OpenAI. So the personality is programmed in post-training, and the knowledge comes from compressing the internet during pre-training. And this knowledge is a little bit out of date, and it's probabilistic and slightly vague. Some of the things that probably are mentioned very frequently on the internet, I will have a lot better recollection of than some of the things that are discussed very rarely, very similar to what you might expect with a human. So let's now talk about some of the repercussions of this entity and how we can talk to it and what kinds of things we can expect from it. Now, I'd like to use real examples when we actually go through this. So for example, this morning, I asked ChatGPT the following: how much caffeine is in 1 shot of Americano? And I was curious because I was comparing it to matcha. Now, ChatGPT will tell me that this is roughly 63 milligrams of caffeine or so. Now, the reason I'm asking ChatGPT this question, that I think this is okay, is number one, I'm not asking about any knowledge that is very recent. So I do expect that the model has sort of read about how much caffeine there's in 1 shot. I don't think this information has changed too much. And number two, I think this information is extremely frequent on the internet. This kind of a question and this kind of information has occurred all over the place on the internet. And because there was so many mentions of it, I expect the model to have good memory of it in its knowledge. So there's no tool use, and the model, the zip file, responded that there's roughly 63 milligrams. Now, I'm not guaranteed that this is the correct answer. This is just its vague recollection of the internet. But I can go to primary sources, and maybe I can look up, caffeine and Americano, and I could verify that, yeah, it looks to be about 63 is roughly right. And you can look at primary sources to decide if this is true or not. So I'm not strictly speaking guaranteed that this is true, but I think probably this is the kind of thing that ChatGPT would know. Here's an example of a conversation I had 2 days ago, actually. And there's another example of a knowledge-based conversation and things that I'm comfortable asking of ChatGPT with some caveats. So I'm a bit sick, I have runny nose, and I want to get meds that help with that. So it told me a bunch of stuff. And I want my nose to not be runny. So I gave it a clarification based on what it said. And then it kind of gave me some of the things that might be helpful with that. And then I looked at some of the meds that I have at home, and I said, does Dayquil or NightQuil work? And it went off and it kind of like went over the ingredients of Dayquil and NyQuil and whether or not they help mitigate runny nose. Now, when these ingredients are coming here, again, remember, we are talking to a zip file that has a recollection of the internet. I'm not guaranteed that these ingredients are correct. And in fact, I actually took out the box and I looked at the ingredients and I made sure that NyQuil ingredients are exactly these ingredients. And I'm doing that because I don't always fully trust what's coming out here, right? This is just a probabilistic statistical recollection of the internet. But that said, conversations of Dayquil and NyQuil, these are very common meds. Probably there's tons of information about a lot of this on the internet, and this is the kind of things that the model have pretty good recollection of. So actually, these were all correct. And then I said, okay, well, I have NyQuil. How fast would it act roughly? And it kind of tells me. And then is acetaminophen basically a Tylenol? And it says yes. So this is a good example of how ChatGPT was useful to me. It is a knowledge-based query. This knowledge sort of isn't recent knowledge. This is all coming from the knowledge of the model. I think this is common information. This is not a high-stakes situation. I'm checking ChatGPT a little bit, but also this is not a high-stakes situation, so no big deal. So I popped a NyQuil, and indeed it helped. But that's roughly how I'm thinking about what's coming back here. Okay, so at this point, I want to make two notes. The first note I want to make is that naturally, as you interact with these models, you'll see that your conversations are growing longer, right? Anytime you are switching topic, I encourage you to always start a new chat. When you start a new chat, as we talked about, you are wiping the context window of tokens and resetting it back to 0. If it is the case that those tokens are not anymore useful to your next query, I encourage you to do this because these tokens in this window are expensive. And they're expensive in kind of like two ways. Number one, if you have lots of tokens here, then the model can actually find it a little bit distracting. So if this was a lot of tokens, the model might, this is kind of like the working memory of the model. The model might be distracted by all the tokens in the past when it is trying to sample tokens much later on. So it could be distracting and it could actually decrease the accuracy of the model and of its performance. And number two, the more tokens are in the window, the more expensive it is by a little bit, not by too much, but by a little bit, to sample the next token in the sequence. So your model is actually slightly slowing down. It's becoming more expensive to calculate the next token, and the more tokens there are here. And so think of the tokens in the context window as a precious resource. Think of that as the working memory of the model, and don't overload it with irrelevant information, and keep it as short as you can. And you can expect that to work faster and slightly better. Of course, if the information actually is related to your task, you may want to keep it in there. But I encourage you to, as often as you can, basically start a new chat whenever you are switching topic. The second thing is that I always encourage you to keep in mind what model you are actually using. So here in the top left, we can drop down and we can see that we are currently using GPT-4o. Now, there are many different models of many different flavors, and there are too many actually, but we'll go through some of these over time. So we are using GPT-4o right now, and in everything that I've shown you, this is GPT-4o. Now, when I open a new incognito window, so if I go to chatgpt.com and I'm not logged in, the model that I'm talking to here, so if I just say hello, the model that I'm talking to here might not be GPT-4o. It might be a smaller version. Now, unfortunately, OpenAI does not tell me when I'm not logged in what model I'm using, which is kind of unfortunate. But it's possible that you are using a smaller, kind of dumber model. So if we go to the ChatGPT pricing page here, we see that they have 3 basic tiers for individuals, the free, plus, and pro. And in the free tier, you have access to what's called GPT-4o Mini. And this is a smaller version of GPT-4o. It is a smaller model with a smaller number of parameters. It's not going to be as creative, like its writing might not be as good. Its knowledge is not going to be as good. It's going to probably hallucinate a bit more, etc. But it is kind of like the free offering, the free tier. They do say that you have limited access to 4o and O3 Mini, but I'm not actually 100% sure. Like, it didn't tell us which model we were using, so we just fundamentally don't know. Now, when you pay for $20 per month, even though it doesn't say this, I think basically like they're screwing up on how they're describing this. But if you go to fine print, limits apply, we can see that the plus users get 80 messages every 3 hours for GPT-4o. So that's the flagship biggest model that's currently available as of today. That's available, and that's what we want to be using. So if you pay $20 per month, you have that with some limits. And then if you pay for $200 per month, you get the Pro, and there's a bunch of additional goodies as well as unlimited GPT-4o. And we're going to go into some of this because I do pay for Pro subscription. Now, the whole takeaway I want you to get from this is be mindful of the models that you're using. Typically with these companies, the bigger models are more expensive to calculate. And so therefore, the companies charge more for the bigger models. And so make those trade-offs for yourself, depending on your usage of LLMs. Have a look at if you can get away with the cheaper offerings. And if the intelligence is not good enough for you and you're using this professionally, you may really want to consider paying for the top tier models that are available from these companies. In my case, in my professional work, I do a lot of coding and a lot of things like that. And this is still very cheap for me. So I pay this very gladly because I get access to some really powerful models that I'll show you in a bit. So yeah, keep track of what model you're using and make those decisions for yourself. I also want to show you that all the other LLM providers will all have different pricing tiers with different models at different tiers that you can pay for. So for example, if we go to Claude from Anthropic, you'll see that I am paying for the professional plan, and that gives me access to Claude 3.5 Sonnet. And if you are not paying for a pro plan, then probably you only have access to maybe Haiku or something like that. And so use the most powerful model that kind of like works for you. Here's an example of me using Claude a while back. I was asking for just travel advice. So I was asking for a cool city to go to, and Claude told me that Zermatt in Switzerland is really cool. So I ended up going there for a New Year's break following Claude's advice. But this is just an example of another thing that I find these models pretty useful for is travel advice and ideation and getting pointers that you can research further. Here we also have an example of Gemini.google.com. So this is from Google. I got Gemini's opinion on the matter, and I asked it for a cool city to go to, and it also recommended Zermatt. So that was nice. So I like to go between different models and asking them similar questions and seeing what they think about. And for Gemini also on the top left, we also have a model selector. So you can pay for the more advanced tiers and use those models. Same thing goes for Grok, just released. We don't want to be asking Grok 2 questions because we know that Grok 3 is the most advanced model. So I want to make sure that I pay enough and such that I have Grok 3 access. So for all these different providers, find the one that works best for you, experiment with different providers, experiment with different pricing tiers for the problems that you are working on. And that's kind of, and often I end up personally just paying for a lot of them and then asking all of them the same question. And I kind of refer to all these models as my LLM council. So they're kind of like the council of language models. If I'm trying to figure out where to go on a vacation, I will ask all of them. And so you can also do that for yourself if that works for you.